the greatest launch title Paradox has ever made, with more base content than ever before, not to mention the sheer amount of quality of life features that make getting into the experience easier than ever before. It's no surprise that Crusader Kings 3 launched to critical acclaim, with arguably the brightest future of any Paradox game, before or since. But now, just shy of 3 years later, it's hard to believe just how little has changed, with just a handful of DLC and updates leaving us wanting more, and wondering what exactly's been going on over at Paradox. But let's go back to the beginning first. See, back when Crusader Kings 3 was announced, its older sibling was still king, though its age was beginning to show, especially when compared to newer releases. See, Crusader Kings 2 is a mess of menus and a clunky UI. Sure, for veterans that mess was a complex interconnected web of decisions, events and politics, but for newer players it was a nightmare getting in. So being the oldest game needing an update, Paradox began working on a sequel. But how do you really follow up an arguably complete game, with more than a decade of support, not to mention mods? Well, the wishlist was pretty simple. A streamlined UI, better graphics and some more quality of life features, and it looked like we were getting just that. With 3D models that aged and evolved over time, a beautiful new map, improvements to the UI across the board, and a whole host of other features, and that's not even getting into the bigger overhauls like War. And on launch everything worked mostly fine, making for a complete experience that could be played by anyone, and enjoyed by everyone. Was it as feature rich as Crusader Kings 2 with its 15 expansions? No. But what was here was great, and ready for Paradox and the modding community to build upon, which they both did, though maybe not in the ways we were all expecting over the past 2.5 years. So what's good? Well, warfare for starters. The heavy micromanaged style from Crusader Kings 2 was replaced by a much smoother rally system, which makes warfare much smoother. This did come at the cost of navies, but that's honestly a good thing. It makes warfare much more direct, and the changes to army composition and development much more meaningful. The new men-at-arms system that has specific units being good in certain terrain and countering other units in a rock-paper-scissors sort of way, instead of micromanaging the biggest stat stick, which is something you can still do here, but at least now it's not the only way to wage war. You could argue it's a dumbed-down system, but for me it works well enough to leave the focus to where I want it to be most, the politics and progression. Something Paradox were obviously aware of, given the new dynasty system, which lets you evolve the development of your family's legacy over multiple rulers. It's a slow system, but at least lets you work towards a specific goal over the long run, without worrying about suddenly losing progression with an event that ends your main character's journey early. And it fits well alongside the focus tree system that's faster and more specifically character focused. Graphically speaking, for a Paradox game, Crusader Kings 3 is heads and shoulders above what I expected. I thought the 3D character models would just be for show and barely interact with the game, but they're actually used really well. Your character slowly ages in a somewhat realistic manner, instead of the instant grey hair of before, and damage to them shows on the portrait. Children even use a mix of the parents' features, so look a lot more realistic than you might expect. I have to talk about the modding community as well. As typical for a Paradox game, it's an absolute standout, but they really have outdone themselves here. There's a bunch of mega overhauls offering a completely new experience, alongside the usual expanded events and customization mods you'd expect. But I want to shout out a really cool mod I've been using for as long as I can remember. Prisoners of War. Made by Stick as part of his mechanical mods collection, it's a super simple mod that makes it so when you or the AI captures a city and some of the key people within, they're attached to the army instead of being immediately teleported to the faction capital's dungeons. It's amazing, and makes for some great comebacks and microplays in an otherwise mostly simple warfare system. It's crazy to me that Paradox haven't made this base game yet. That said, the base game's mechanics are pretty good as is, and at their best make you feel like a scheming genius as you get more experience playing the game. A simple but standout moment for me was when I wanted to conquer a neighbouring region. As a newer player, I would often fabricate a claim, which takes a while, then foster some alliances and go to war, slowly conquering the region and claiming it for myself. But after playing enough, I simply invited claimants, then got someone who had a claim, letting me skip the fabrication step, broke my opponent's biggest alliance by sending an agent to break a marriage, and then went to war to press my claim and got a loyal vassal ready to take over. And that's just a really simple example of some of the cool things you can do. As for DLC, well, instead of re-releasing old content as new DLCs like some of us expected, Paradox instead made the decision to make totally new ones, which is good, though I wouldn't say it's been that successful either. See, it's the DLC that really showcases the problems Crusader Kings 3 had, has, and will continue to have. They're just shy of 3 years the game's been out, there's only been 4 DLC releases, a far cry from Crusader Kings 2, and made only worse when you consider one is just a flavor pack, and the other a faction pack that doesn't really add anything interesting for anyone not playing the Northern Lords, or the areas around them. Now I know what you might be saying, isn't this what we've been asking for forever? For Paradox to release less DLC with more content in each? Well yes, but they haven't really done that here either. The DLC for Crusader Kings 3 is the same as the DLC in any of their other games, there's just a lot less of it. And a big reason for that was the Royal Court DLC, the first major DLC for the game that promised a lot, new relics, events and a 3D court alongside an expanded culture system. Now according to Paradox, the 3D court and models took significant development time that delayed this DLC a lot, but the end result is mediocre anyways. The new 3D court ends up being as static as the 2D character item screen anyways, with its biggest use in the forbidden mods. Not to mention the court doesn't even allow for proper role playing. Like say you want to address the peasantry's problems and maybe convince the uprising leader to join you diplomatically instead of doing the usual crush the rebellion and force recruit him. Well you can't. You also can't request to hear nobles' feedback, invite anyone, or really do anything but hold court and get 3 random events. It plays like a totally separate piece to the rest of the game instead of being interwoven with existing mechanics and characters. The relic system also didn't really add much, and they just sit in the court without any interesting events tied to them, not to mention the price increase for this DLC. It's not a bad DLC, but given the weight and lack of content, it's really disappointing. You could argue the global lockdown is also to blame, but come on, the other games still progressed, and despite Sweden not having a lockdown, it's not like anything changed afterwards. Sure, the free DLC that came with the patch was good, but it's also the only free expansion content we've ever got. Up next was the Fate of Iberia DLC, adding the struggle system that affected how characters and nations interact. It's actually really good, though it's just for Iberia. Like come on Paradox, why has this not been expanded to everyone? And yes, I know modders have done it, but this is something that should have been done by the developers and then expanded on by the modding community, not just added in one region and then left for everyone else to move. By leaving it to the modding community, the feature doesn't get to be as unique as Paradox themselves could have made it, so it ends up feeling very samey in most places and out of place in others. Then came the Friends and Foes DLC, basically a flavor pack from the other Paradox games. That's nowhere near as bad as the Steam reviews would have you believe, but it's not the DLC the game needed, and it does highlight a bigger problem with the event system that I will talk about later. Now aside from the DLCs, there's some issues that still exist in the base game, like the stress system. I get why it's there, but in its current state, it's way too easy to just ignore or game, by just doing a few of the hunt or feast events to negate the debuff. Sure, you can get unlucky, but for the most part it's a non-factor. I would have preferred a more permanent system with fewer events that trigger it, making each event more meaningful, instead of none of these stress events mattering unless they cause a level up. Speaking of events, they are really repetitive and memey. Like I get Crusader Kings 2 had some funny events here and there, but is it just me or are the events here too out there, with too many jokey or inappropriate ones instead of more political and serious ones? I get there's mods for this, but it does kind of make me wonder what the focus is for Paradox. That's not really helped by how samey every faction feels to play. Sure, there are cultural and faith differences, but for the most part, every faction has the same mechanics and play the exact same, from events to gameplay. This, mixed with the general lack of threat from the AI, excluding the Northern Lords, means that most of the campaigns feel the same pretty quickly, no matter where you play. The building system suffers the same issue. It's not bad, but it's also not very interesting or unique. I was hoping for something like Civ 6's district system, where different domains could specialize in different things, like a farming domain or a knight focused one, with appropriate buffs depending on the culture and region. Instead, every building gives a tiny buff to something or other, and in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter what you build or where you build it. Speaking of building, Crusader Kings 3 really nails kingdom building, but once you make it there isn't really anything to stop you snowballing. Sure, there's factions and uprisings and the like, but they don't really feel like a real threat, and there aren't that many interesting decisions to make beyond succession. Like, why can't I pay a rebel army to try and overthrow a neighbouring region and become my vassal? Or why don't corrupt vassals try and install puppet ministers elsewhere in my cabinet to make their uprising much stronger? Or even something really out there like something supernatural. At the very least, they could take a look at the crusade mechanics, because the AI doesn't seem to know what it's doing here at all. It will either send a tiny portion of its massive army in one at a time to get completely wiped out, or group up and then just run around and starve until attrition wipes them out. I get you can't exactly have smart AI in these sort of games, but at least give them some pre-written paths to follow, because right now it's a joke. Now that might have seemed quite negative, but the upcoming DLC Tours and Tournaments looks like it's going to change quite a lot. Paradox finally seem to have learnt their lesson, so the new travel mechanic looks like it's for everyone and weaves into the existing systems, so you can interact with specific factions and characters instead of relying on random chance. There's also way more interaction with vassals and other named characters through the event overhauls, adding both new types and expanding on how we interact with existing ones. Honestly, if it's even half as good as it looks, then it seems Crusader Kings 3 might finally be getting the big break we've all been waiting for. At the very least, this will help expand the overhaul mods even further, but there's still a lot more to look forward to in the future. Merchant Republics have got to be arriving soon, alongside hopefully some more flavor packs that help make different nations more unique. I'm also hoping to see something that makes the endgame more chaotic, and hey, if we're really lucky, maybe Paradox might throw in a supernatural DLC or two.